How did the Romans view the changing world after the so-called fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD? And by that I mean the fall of the Western Roman Empire, because the other half actually survived for 1,000 years longer. How did the Romans see the period from the late 5th century until around the early 7th century? What did the Romans and other nations think about the Roman Empire? Was it for them a time of decline and of destruction? Did they think that their empire had fallen? Or did they maybe think entirely differently from how we see that time? What if I told you that the Romans living in 476 AD in Italy had no idea that their empire had supposedly fallen? That might at first sound surprising, but if you would time travel to 476 AD and ask random people in Rome of that year if they thought that their empire had just fallen, they would think you're crazy. Sure, there was some sort of civil war going on in northern Italy, where once again a usurper had been deposed by another one, as had happened so many times before. But why should that be a fall? Oh, because the deposed usurper was a Roman boy, 16 years of age, and the usurper was of barbarian origin, a man called Odoacer? But why should this be different from all the other times where this had happened before? When Ricimer, the infamous barbarian general, had violently deposed so many emperors before? How was that different? Had the Roman Empire fallen back then as well? In fact, many Roman senators even backed Odoacer because they saw him as a strong military leader. By that time, the main backbone of the Western Roman army were foederati anyway, Germanic mercenary soldiers in the service of Rome. And so, more often than not, the generals of the army were of Germanic origin as well. The senators in Rome thought that Odoacer was a man more capable of defending Italy from barbarian incursions than the powerless child emperor Romulus Augustus. But a fall? Absolutely not. In fact, this was seen as a step in the right direction by many. For why have a powerless emperor when the real power was held by a Germanic general anyways? And indeed, Odoacer ruled over Italy as a viceroy of the emperor at Constantinople. Coins were even minted at Rome and Ravenna in the name of the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno. All Roman buildings, infrastructure, institutions continued unchanged as if nothing had happened. A fall? There was no sense of a fall to be found in Italy. Later then, in 489, a new Germanic tribe arrived in Italy, taking over power, namely the Ostrogoths. Their king Theodoric became the new ruler of Italy in 493. So was that now the fall of Rome? Well, actually, this new Germanic on the throne was pretty much beloved by the whole Roman population. Here is what Bishop Enodius of Ticinum, a city that is today called Pavia, for example, thought of the new ruler of Italy. He wrote that Theodoric washed away filth from the greater part of Italy, leaving Rome as it emerged from the ashes living again. He further wrote that Theodoric's military victories meant that, quote, the Roman Empire has returned to its former boundary, unquote, and returned, quote, the culture of our ancestors, unquote, to Romans who had lived in the regions he had reconquered. Enodius even went so far as to claim that the revival of the Roman renown brought Theodoric forward as a rival to Alexander the Great, because he had sparked a Roman golden age. Note that Enodius of Pavia was a true Roman called Magnus Felix Enodius, and his views were not without reason. Theodoric had many buildings repaired, for instance, the aqueduct of Ravenna. He had many baths and amphitheaters repaired as well in a few cities. And in Rome, several buildings were repaired and protected under strict laws for the protection of buildings under his rule. If you are a fan of Roman history and you would want to buy an item for yourself or someone else as a present, then you might want to consider the SPQR Shop. They produce incredible replicas of Roman history with a very high attention to detail. All their items are carefully handcrafted, and I think it will be difficult to find that level of craftsmanship anywhere else. They handcraft Roman coin replicas, rings, pendants, attributes, and many other items of Roman history. If you want to support the channel, or if you want to buy a present for someone who likes Roman history, please go and check out their excellent site, link in the description. If you buy over this link, you will receive a 20% price reduction, which I personally find very generous. Thank you very much for your consideration, and back to the video. In 520 AD, a Roman could still go to the baths the same way as hundreds of years before. A Roman aristocrat still possessed extensive land estates, Roman villas in the countryside, and the Roman way of life in those days in Italy was still through and through Roman. In fact, Theodoric was so successful that for most of his reign, the people of Rome even called him emperor. And he indeed was emperor in all but name, even though he never officially took that title, nominally always remaining in rank below the emperor in Constantinople and officially reigning Italy in his stead. In reality, of course, he held total control, but he accepted Roman laws and the institutions as they had been for many centuries. Around 520 AD, it even looked as if the Western Roman Empire would be resurrected as some sort of Romano-Gothic empire. Theodoric had managed to also rule over the Visigothic kingdom and had managed to establish a hegemony over the Vandal kingdom as well. Unfortunately, however, this didn't last long, but we can imagine that this must have been quite a powerful feeling for the Romans of that time. A feeling of resurgence, as if the Roman Empire was returning to life in the West. Life in the 520s AD looked a lot better than in the time of the Western emperors of the 5th century AD, with constant civil wars and constant barbarian invasions. We could actually call the 60 years from 476 AD to 536 AD some sort of brief golden period, in which it seemed as if Italy would enter a new golden age. But unfortunately, it was not to last. Yes, nominally, Theodoric was a subjugate of the emperor at Constantinople, but in reality, he ruled Italy independently. And then, in the last years of his life, unfortunately, he grew more and more paranoid and thus became tyrannical with his old age. Two Roman statesmen, Symmachus and Boetius, were condemned to death on charges of conspiracy. This would lead to a reaction of outrage at Constantinople, understandably so, as these two had been members of illustrious Roman families. Boetius was of the Anici, an old influential aristocratic family known perhaps from the short-lived Roman emperor Olybrius, who had himself been a member of that family. Quintus Aurelius Symmachus was of the Symmachi, one of the richest and most influential senatorial families at Rome. And these families had a lot of members in Constantinople. Thus, the mood began to shift in the East. It was during that time that the fall of Rome in 476 AD was invented. Around the time of the execution of Boetius and Symmachus, so in the 510s to 520s AD, Marcellinus Comes, an Eastern Roman writer, had written a historical work called Chronicle, in which he wrote that Odoacer, the king of the Goths, as he called him, had caused the Roman Empire to perish in 476 AD. This is even more so funny because Odoacer was actually not a Goth. And it should come as no surprise that Marcellinus Comes was already back then working as an aide to the future Emperor Justinian, who already in that time had become very influential in Eastern Roman politics. Unfortunately, the last years of Theodoric's reign, being more paranoid and tyrannical, further fueled the Eastern Roman propaganda, and thus the Eastern Roman Empire attacked the Ostrogothic kingdom in 536 AD. Procopius of Caesarea proclaimed in his work The Gothic War that Rome had been liberated from the barbarians after 60 years and was now again under Roman control. Unfortunately though, a war that should have been over quickly dragged on for almost 30 more years into the early 560s AD. Entire cities were depopulated and destroyed, millions killed by famine, war and plague, and Italy after these decades of war had indeed become a shadow of its former self, a depopulated wasteland. Even though the map of the year 565 looked nice on paper, with many parts of the former Western Roman Empire again under rule of a Roman emperor at Constantinople, the Romans of Italy, however, were not in a celebratory mood. There was no praise for this grand Roman victory coming from the Italian Romans, who had seen their cities destroyed, their infrastructure now really starting to fall into decay, their old and illustrious institutions overthrown. However, the mood in Constantinople, on the other hand, and in the East in general, was of course great. The plague was slowly subsiding, the war had been won, and the Roman Empire was restored in many parts of the West. The East profited massively from the devastation of the West, as many Romans there, understandably, had fled to the East. So from an Eastern perspective, far away from the wars in the West, it indeed seemed as if the Roman Empire was rising again. But in other parts of the former Western Roman Empire, the mood was great as well. We should not forget that Vandal Africa had been liberated from Vandal rule in 534, and southern Spain had been again brought under Roman rule in 552. The mood in newly restored Roman Africa was of course great, since the Nicene Christians there had been long suppressed by the Arian Vandals, and they now enjoyed the free practice of their religion again after the Vandal kingdom had been reconquered by the Romans. Thus, of course, there was a great sense of renewal and optimism for the Roman Empire in those parts. As was the case in Spania, the newly established province of southern Hispania, which had been conquered by the Visigoths in the 460s AD and then reconquered by the Roman Empire in 552. The Visigoths saw these people as Romans and not as Byzantines or Eastern Romans. The proof is manifold. For one, the natives of Spania still spoke Latin in those days, as inscriptions from that time show. But there is also an interesting text from a Frankish chronicle that was written around 650 AD, called the Chronicle of Fredegar. In it, there is a fascinating passage detailing how the Visigoths reconquered the province of Spania under King Sisebut in the 610s. Quote, King Sisbodus took many cities from the Roman Empire along the coast, destroying them and reducing them to rubble. End quote. Note that the text wrote Roman Empire. Not Eastern Roman Empire, not Byzantine Empire, not Greeks, but Roman Empire. So not only to the Romans in Italy or to the Romans in the East, the Roman Empire was still the Roman Empire, but to other nations as well. But even cities outside of what we would think as the boundaries of the Roman Empire also saw themselves as being part of the Roman Empire. For instance, in Olbia, which lies in today's southern France, a city that had been founded by the Greeks in 350 BC, and which for many centuries had been part of the Roman Empire. Archaeologists found a stone with an inscription which dates from the time of the Emperor Heraclius, so from 610 to 641 AD. And what is fascinating is that this inscription says that the city saw itself as being part of the Roman Empire in that time, and they saw Heraclius as their emperor. And that in a time where modern historians, in my opinion, already far too often and unjustly use the term Byzantine. But the inhabitants of Olbia saw themselves as Romans, as verified by the inscription dedicated to their emperor Heraclius. It is even more fascinating since Olbia lies outside the boundaries of many of the maps that show the Roman Empire after the reconquests of Justinian, supposedly at its largest extent. So these maps are not entirely correct. We actually often don't really know where the boundaries were exactly. And so maps of ancient times should always be taken with a grain of salt. In any case, we could clearly see that not only for the Romans, but also for the Franks or the Visigoths, the Roman Empire of the years 500 to 600 AD was still very much the same Roman Empire from, say, 450 AD. So who are we to say that it wasn't so? Who are we to say that the Romans living in Spania in 600 AD weren't Romans anymore, just because it doesn't fit a simplified historical narrative? Neither did the Romans back then think that their empire had fallen, nor did others think so. In fact, many saw this as a time of resurgence and a great comeback of the Roman Empire. Except maybe the poor people in Italy, which indeed had been pretty much devastated by the long and brutal Gothic War. However, in many other parts, it really looked as if the Roman Empire had made a great comeback. Unfortunately though, as we know in hindsight, it wouldn't stay that way. If you liked this video, please consider supporting this channel via Patreon or via YouTube membership, because it is your support which makes this channel possible. You would have my utmost gratitude, and I would especially like to thank our new Sol Invictus supporter, Net7. Thank you so much, Net7, for supporting Maiorianus in such a generous way. I think even Majorian himself would be proud. And I would especially like to thank our Sol Invictus member Caesar Cheese, who actually visited Olbia and told me about the fascinating discovery of the stone found there, dedicated to the Emperor Heraclius. And of course I want to thank everybody who supports Maiorianus. You people are amazing. And if you want to learn more about the fascinating forgotten Roman province of Spania, you can watch this video in the upper right corner. But if you want to learn more about the utter devastation that the Gothic Wars caused, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.